Life had been good in the oil patch for 20 years. And then on April 20th of last year, tragedy struck. The Macondo drill was done in what's called the Mississippi Trench, which is an area running almost directly out from the mouth of the Mississippi River. It had been known as an area that was going to be high risk. It was deep. It had an uncertain geological formation, very high pressures, 17,000 feet per square inch, and high temperatures. Into that risky environment, a number of companies bid for the right to drill. BP submitted the highest offer. They got the permit. BP was a troubled company. It had had, of the major oil companies, it had had the worst safety records, major negative events, particularly at their Texas oil refinery and in Alaska. So you've ended up with the company that had the shakiest safety record drilling in maybe one of the riskiest places in the Gulf. Problems started early. Drilling began in the spring and summer of 2009 in order to get the excavation finished before the hurricane season. But they had a number of problems from the beginning, leading to delays such that they ended up in the hurricane season 45 days behind schedule, and a hurricane hit and damaged the rig that was being used initially to the point that it had to go back for major repairs. BP then contracted with Transocean for one of the newest state-of-the-art rigs that was available called Deepwater Horizon. And it came on site early in 2010. It also had already been contracted for another drill that was going to begin in May of 2010. So throughout the drilling process, there not only was the pressure to make up the time that had been lost, but also to get it finished in time for the rig, Deepwater Horizon, to move on to its next assignment. On April 20th, the tragedy occurred. There were our report, which this is the short form of a 500-page report called Deepwater, the Gulf Disaster, and the Future of Offshore Drilling. We found that there were at least 9 major mistakes. Some of those were mistakes of oversight. Some were mistakes of misreading information. Some were mistakes of ignoring negative information. I mentioned that one of the key problems was the cement. There are going to be a few times in this speech where I'm going to suggest that if you want to take a nap, it's going to get really dull, and this would be a time to do so. I think that's something a speaker owes to the audience. So this is one of those times. The reason you put cement down a drilling pipe at the end of the process is to seal the pipe from these enormous pressures that I mentioned they were encountering, and avoid the gas getting into the drill pipe. This is generally done at the very end of the process. Halliburton had been contracted to do the cement. Now, cement for this is not the kind of cement that you'd order if you were doing building construction or some other more conventional use. It is a highly sophisticated recipe which is designed to hold, given the specific conditions of geology, pressure, and temperature that are going to exist at that site. Halliburton had tested their recipe twice in a laboratory. It failed twice. The third time they tested it was when they poured it in the pipe at Macondo, and it failed a third time. Because it failed, it allowed gas to get in the pipe, what in the trade they call a kick. the gas quickly got above the blowout preventer. There's been a lot of discussion about what the blowout preventer's failure meant. It did not mean that there would not have been an explosion because the gas had already escaped. It would have contained the petroleum and reduced the amount of oil that was released in the Gulf. That tragedy of April the 20th was then compounded as we stumbled through the response and containment plan. Every company, to get a permit to drill, has to submit what would you do if there were an accident and demonstrate that you've got the ability to carry out what's in your plan. That was a joke. In the case not only of BP, but a number of other major oil companies, they had submitted response plans for drilling in the Gulf of Mexico that provided for protection of polar bears and walruses and other animals that haven't been seen in the Gulf of Mexico in a hell of a long time. They also provided that they had experts that were supposed to be on call to respond. One man had been dead for 4 years, was still on the list. And these plans were quickly proven to be shams. There was no containment capability. The industry stumbled around for the better part of a month trying to figure out what to do. One of the basic problems was they miscalculated the amount of oil that was coming out of the pipe. The initial estimates by BP was that it was 1,000 barrels a day. 30 days later, it was actually determined it was over 60,000 barrels a day were coming out of the pipe. So all of those initial efforts that we all watched on TV and read about were doomed from the beginning because they were so out of scale with what was actually happening. We also found out that there had been almost no progress in how to deal with an offshore oil event since the last big event, which was called Exxon Valdez, had occurred in an interior water body when a tanker went aground and spilled hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil into that water body. Although Congress had passed an Oil Spill Pollution Act, which indicated that there was going to be a substantial investment in research so that we would better understand how to deal with a major oil spill, that lasted about 4 years. And then as things happened, other events took over the minds of the Congress. Interest in oil spill prevention waned, and the research dried up. And we found out 21 years later, we knew almost no more about how to deal with these than we had at Exxon Valdez. The co-chair of the commission, as Jennifer said, was Bill Riley, who had been EPA administrator during Exxon Valdez. So he was intimately familiar with the problems then, and then how little progress had been made. Well, what are some of the lessons that we can learn? First is that this was an avoidable incident. It was not an act of God or nature. It was an act of mismanagement, of a culture of not respecting safety by our industry. Second, it was a case in which offense overran defense. Beginning in about 1990, large amounts of money were spent to technically deal with the very challenging problems of how do you drill in such deep water. There was no parallel expenditure on the defense of what do you do if something went wrong drilling in deep water. Next, there were warning signals that this could happen. 8 months before 8 months before Macondo, there was a drill site. The permittee was a company from Thailand drilling off the northwest coast of Australia. That was called the Montara. The Montara also exploded. Guess what was seen to be the principal cause of their explosion? Bad cement. Guess who poured the cement for the Montara? Halliburton. Nobody at BP seemed to have had the faintest memory of the fact that there had been an incident 8 months before that had an eerily similar track to what was going to occur at Macondo. There was another lesson was there was an attitude that it can't happen here, so why worry? And the fact is that the industry had a good record as long as they were drilling where they knew what they were doing in relatively shallow waters. But as they began to move into these deeper and inherently more risky waters, they didn't accelerate their learning curve. And therefore, it not only could happen, it did happen. We also learned, sadly, that the United States was not the leader. In fact, as one person described it, the United States is looking at the taillights of most of the world in terms of safety and offshore drilling. I'll just give you one. I'm going to give you a question, and then I'll give you the answer. If you're good. If you're not good, you'll go home ignorant and bemused. The Gulf has there's another area in the world which is equivalent to the Gulf in offshore drilling, and that is the North Sea between Norway and the UK. The North Sea is a very bitter, intimidating climate place, rough waters, high number of days that are at freezing or lower temperatures. The Gulf, on the other hand, is a very benign environment except for an occasional hurricane. The attempt that we made to try to evaluate accident rates between the two places proved to be futile because they don't keep consistent records. But one place that you can't fudge it is fatalities. I mean, there is a body that is sadly going to have to be dealt with. What do you think is the ratio, using consistent number of hours worked, of fatalities in the Gulf of Mexico as opposed to the bitter North Sea? Well, the answer is, for every fatality in the North Sea, there are almost 5 fatalities in the Gulf of Mexico. That single statistic sort of seizes the mind of how serious the problem of lack of safety is. Next lesson learned was there was an excessively cozy relationship, and cozy, my speech is going to be a PG-rated speech, so I'm not going to tell you just how cozy it got, but it was plenty cozy, between the regulator, what was then called MMS, and the industry. What made this particularly distressing is this is not just a case of government going in and regulating a private business. Who owns the Gulf of Mexico? Who has title? Who has prudent responsibility for the protection of this asset? It's the people of the United States of America. Anybody who is using the Gulf of Mexico is doing so at the will of the American people to allow them to do so. So the American government, in my opinion, has a primary responsibility to be a prudent landlord to assure that your property isn't trashed by the person who's your tenant, as well as a regulator for safety, human protection, and environmental protection. And finally, we learned that America does not have an energy policy. We learned, as an example, we don't have the option of saying, let's declare offshore drilling too risky, we cannot afford to continue to do it, let's shut it down. Almost a third of the roughly 10 million barrels of oil lifted every day in the United States comes from the Gulf of Mexico. It is a very big part of our domestic petroleum resource. We don't have the option of shutting it down. We do have the option of making it world class in terms of its safety. There's some other facts. Oh, and incidentally, this is another place if you want to take a nap. It's going to get pretty dull right here, too. The United States sits on top, the United States uses about 22% of all the oil produced in the world, and it's about 85 to 90 million barrels are produced every day worldwide. We use 22% of that. The United States sits on top of, in terms of our proven reserves. This includes the Atlantic off North Carolina. This includes the Gulf off Florida. This includes Alaska. All those places, we sit on top of about 1.5% of the known proven reserves in the world. Those are unsustainable statistics. You can't use 22% of the world's total and only have 1.5% of the proven reserves that are under your direct control. And I might say that 1.5% is a declining percentage, a rapidly declining percentage. There are some who say that we should drill, baby, drill, that the way we're going to get gas prices down, the way we're going to reduce our dependence on foreign oil is to drill, baby, drill. Okay, I'm going to give you another question. You didn't do very well on my first question. I'm very disappointed, but this is your time for redemption. If we were to go to the drill, baby, drill strategy of going totally domestic with our petroleum, when do you think the last drop of oil would be lifted in the United States? Well, the answer to the question, and somebody gave an answer that was pretty close, is 2031. So we have 20 years at full production. If we continue at what is in fact our current allocation, we produce 48% of what we consume. The rest of the world produces 52%. We can stretch that to the year 2064. We have a serious problem. Now, what have we done? We've had this tremendous tragedy. It has exposed a lot of fundamental problems. It has exposed the fact that we have a major energy crisis facing us. Well, now, other industries have responded to similar events in a very aggressive way. After Bhopal, the chemical factory that blew up in India, the chemical industry, as an industry, adopted some very strong standards and the capacity to enforce those standards. After 3 Mile Island occurred in 1979, the nuclear power industry similarly adopted a set of safety standards. They call it INPO, is their organization, and they aggressively enforce those standards. Both of those industries now are world class in terms of their safety standards. The question is, will the offshore oil and gas industry see Macondo as their Bhopal or their 3 Mile Island? The answer to date is not very encouraging. Maybe symbolic of this is that Transocean, within the last 30 days, sent out a notice to their shareholders saying 2010 is the safest year we've ever had. And we therefore are going to pay large bonuses to our executives because safety is one of the factors that goes into whether they have earned their bonus. My God, I hate to think what would happen if they didn't earn their bonus. There also has been a reluctance in the oil industry to do what we recommended, which was model after chemical and nuclear power and develop your own industry independent capability to enhance higher safety standards. At the executive branch, there's been some considerable reorganization, one of those being to split the agencies within the Department of Interior responsible for revenue collection, royalties, from those responsible for safety. We had 3 former directors of MMS, the previous organization in the Department of Interior for offshore oil, and they said that without exception, every time there was an issue that required a decision, shall we decide it A, to maximize safety, or B, to maximize royalties, B won. We hope that by splitting those 2 functions, that will be less likely to occur. But the department still suffers from very inadequate funding. As an example, in the Gulf, the average inspector is responsible for between 40 and 50 rigs. That means they just have a few hours every day on an individual rig. In California, which has a much smaller offshore industry and no deepwater, they have one inspector for every 5 rigs. That's just an example of the lack of adequacy of our oversight. Congress has, frankly, been a real disappointment. The only legislation that has yet moved out of a committee will make it less safe by requiring expansion into the Atlantic and into the eastern Gulf, and reducing the amount of time available to the regulators to review permit applications for their safety. There have been no additional funds for research. We're on a path to be as ignorant 21 years after Macondo as we were 21 years after Exxon Valdez, and that while there have been some increases in funding for the regulatory function, we think they have been inadequate. So we've got a big job ahead of us.